there is a huge demand for specialization and for just really great people. I think it's a great time to be an entrepreneur. I think it's a great time if you already have a firm like that to grow in that. I think specialized firms, particularly in high value niches, have a tremendous future in front of them.
On today's episode of Signal in the Noise, we sit down with Bob Feldman, communications veteran and a remarkable career spanning leadership roles, industry accolades, and has a ton of bold ideas for the future of the function. And in this really thoughtful conversation, we unpack why Bob believes specialized, high-value boutique agencies are on the rise and why they're thriving vis-a-vis the bigger holding companies. He talks about the importance of pushing beyond your comfort zone and continuously learning, especially as AI reshapes the comms landscape. He talks about the origins of the Dialogue Project, which was sparked by Bob's award-winning Page Society speech, and how it's helping leaders navigate in the corporate world, polarization in the workplace, and indeed society at large. And finally, Bob paints a really compelling picture of what the communications function of the future could look like, which, as a spoiler, is a team powered by data, interdisciplinary thinking, and cross-functional collaboration grounded in a diversity of industry experiences. Tune in for an awesome episode of Signal in the Noise with Bob Feldman. Hi, everybody. This is Dan Gaynor, host of Signal in the Noise, and I'm thrilled to welcome an awesome guest today. Welcome, Bob Feldman. Bob, where are you beaming in from today?
Danny, I am in sunny Los Angeles.
Fabulous. Pretty cool. I'm really excited to have you on today because you have one of the most diverse and interesting backgrounds. Your career arc is truly its own cinematic journey, so to speak. Just to give a quick overview, and then I want you to dive into your background. You've done things like leadership at big agency holding groups. You've started a company that was acquired. You've coalesced multiple agencies into one giant package that then was sold itself. You are an investor at FHS Capital Partners, and then you've taken your skill set and applied it to the public realm, trying to foster a more civic dialogue at literally what's called the Dialogue Project based at Duke University. I'm sure you can do a much better job than me talking about the career arc. Let's start, maybe not from birth, but perhaps post-college. Walk me through how you got to where you're at.
Well, I started right out of school at what was then Burson Marsteller, is today just Burson, and had a great time there. I'm still wrestling with the fact that on one hand, I've done a lot of things, but on the other, I kind of always took pride in the fact that, like, when I started out of school at Burson, I was there almost 10 years, and then I went to Ketchum, and I was there for about 9 years. So I always kind of thought of myself as much more stable than the average person, but then I guess, it's just a matter of time before you kind of catch up and have done a bunch of different things.
Compared to the tenure of most people in comms, you are a true loyalist. So
Yeah, right,
very
exactly.
impressive.
Hey, guys, had a great time at Burson Marsteller. Learned a lot and worked across multiple kind of industry sectors, and then had the opportunity to go to Ketchum. Still a great agency. At the time, I was asked to come in to run the New York office. Did that for a number of years, and then ran most of the U.S. company there. And I was excited to Ketchum with great people, many of whom I'm still good friends with. I was there for like 8 or 9 years. And then had the opportunity to go to Gray. Gray Advertising at the time was not yet owned by WPP, but had a global PR company, about 40 offices around the world, and was offered the opportunity to go there to be their global chief executive. And did that. Great experience, helping to grow the firm as well as acquisitions and try to integrate it so that it was, what we used to call a one firm as opposed to just a series of, say, individual offices or acquisitions.
Far ahead of its time, and by the way, a highly relevant lesson that many holding groups are still learning.
Yeah, good point. And so I was there about 8 years after, maybe about 7 years in or so, we were acquired by WPP. I should point out, when I was at Burson, we were acquired by Young and Rubicam going back in the day. Ketchum, I was on the board of Ketchum when we sold to Omnicom. And then, I was at Gray when we sold to WPP. So I did have, a fair amount of experience working with kind of these larger holding companies. And, by and large, I would tell you I'm net positive about the companies. But like the holding, not just the holding companies, but like any agency, any professional service firm, to a certain extent, it's the leadership and it's the people that you deal with on a day-to-day basis that kind of make or break it. And if you want, at some point, we could talk about, the holding company model these days and how it's going and the role of private equity and blah, blah, blah. In any case, I was running GCI Group for a number of years. And out of the blue, actually, a good friend of mine who I'm now a business partner with, Bill Heyman, who had a recruiting business, still Heyman Associates. Bill's retired from it, but Heyman Associates is still quite
Sure, quite well
active.
known. I mean, basically, if you're a CCO, you're placed through those guys.
Yeah. So Bill called me up one day and asked if I wanted to meet with Jeffrey Katzenberg because DreamWorks Animation was spinning out of DreamWorks, the private company studio, to go public and become its own independent company. So I did, and without boring with all the details, we hit it off. Next thing you know, I decided, okay, let's move to LA. My wife and my daughter at the time, who was, well, she's still my daughter, but at the time she was still at home. She was about to go into ninth grade. We have two other kids. They were older. One was already in college, the other in law school. We decided, let's do it. So I moved to the West Coast. That was 2005, so like 20 years ago right now, to head up corporate communications, corporate marketing at DreamWorks Animation as the company went public. Did that for 2 or 3 years, then started my own firm. Jeff Hunt, longtime great friend, partnered with me. We created what was called Pulse Point Group. We defined the business as a communications management consulting firm, meaning we tried to stay at kind of strategy management level. We really didn't do a lot of, day-to-day implementation work. We often partnered with, the McKinseys and Bains of the world with companies as opposed to necessarily PR or marketing agencies. Did that for a number of years, and we wound up selling. Initially, we sold to Olson. It was like a two-step process. Olson was a big Midwest, Minneapolis-based advertising marketing agency. They were owned by a private equity group. We liked those guys a lot. They kind of thought that the work that Jeff and I and the whole team was doing at Pulse Point would add value to their business. They were about to sell. They wound up selling to ICF, large technology management consulting firm based in DC. So we became part of ICF. And as you referenced, a couple of years later, I had suggested to the leadership at ICF that they had acquired a number of small agencies, kind of like ours, and that it really made the most sense to pull all these things together and become a much more powerful brand that was integrated and all that kind of stuff. And so they asked me to kind of lead that process and worked with a lot of really great people there, and that created what became known as ICF Next, where we pulled it all together. And very successful, and then with new leadership at ICF, they took the ICF Next company and sold it to a private equity group, and today it exists and I think is doing quite well, called Fadon. And I left the firm basically kind of semi-retired after kind of leading that whole process. And since then, I've been devoting a fair amount of my time. You referenced to two things. One is the Dialogue Project that's housed at Duke University. We could talk about that. And then the other is the investing in emerging and, kind of high growth potential marketing communications firms. And I do that with Bill Heyman and Don Spetner, FHS Capital Partners. And we're always looking for emerging talent that could use some help, not just financially, but in terms of strategy, in terms of, business development and things like that. So I don't know, all this stuff, I guess, kind of keeps me off the streets.
Well, I mean, what an incredible run. You've done everything from like the IPO to private equity backed buyouts to becoming an investor yourself to now doing your best to fix civic discourse. So just to dive in, actually on the FHS capital side of things, you have a very interesting purview into where the future of the communications industry is going. I mean, for example, Burson, of course, just combined two big holding companies. WPP is, I believe, or Omnicom is buying IPG, correct? So that there's another big holding company coming together. I'd just be interested, as somebody who worked at Weber Shandwick, and a lot of our listeners come from the agency landscape or have agency experience or employ some of these agencies. Where do you see things going? Do you see sort of these like mega cruise ships being built, or simultaneously do you eventually see more opportunity for small bits and bobs to be fractioned off, and actually it's going to be more about a sea of boutiques or somewhere in the middle? I would just be interested, like, where do you see the agency landscape in particular evolving in the next couple of years?
I think you're going to see more and more really high value boutiques. And I think the boutiques probably will wind up needing to be described as something else because they're going to become more like, I don't know, FGS Global or Real Chemistry. They're going to be, you know, global and large firms. So, I think sometimes when you hear the word boutique, you think of a boutique, you think of something that's a little bit smaller than that. There is a huge demand for specialization and for just really great people. I think it's a great time to be an entrepreneur. I think it's a great time if you already have a firm like that to grow in that. I think specialized firms, particularly in high value niches, have a tremendous future in front of them. I think the large agencies have a lot of opportunity, but like with any large established firm, kind of changing the DNA, or maybe not the DNA, but kind of changing the capabilities and the strategic focus of the firm is incredibly difficult. I think large firms are uniquely positioned to handle really large global opportunities. So those companies that require global support, there's a handful of really great firms that do that, and I think they do that incredibly well, and that's kind of your go-to. I think, with not just AI, but just with all aspects of stakeholder relationships, which ultimately can include public affairs, public policy work, it include marketing work, it could include corporate reputation, communications work. All of that stuff is all kind of blending and merging. And, I think the clarity of functional lines on an org chart continue to blur. And what that means for agencies or for people just listening to this podcast or watching it is it's all about talent, and it's a jump ball. I don't care where you can. You can come from the PR side, you come from public affairs, you can come from marketing. It doesn't make a damn bit of difference. If you're really good, if you're really smart, you understand business strategy, and you know how to kind of move it forward, you will be put in a leadership position. So I think for people in the communication space, that is an enormous opportunity. But frankly, it's also a substantial threat because you've got to expand your portfolio of expertise from whatever it's been you've been doing to kind of this broader portfolio. Now, the same challenge goes for people in public policy, the same challenge goes for people in marketing and so forth. And I think that large scale integration is where the big agencies have some opportunity. But, getting a PR agency or what had been an advertising agency or a public policy shop to be able to pull people together and have an organization that does all of those things, or at least have expertise in those things, knows how to draw on the right resources. Big opportunity, but man, that is a big challenge.
And I'm interested, that's the people side of the equation. The other emerging side of the yin and yang spectrum, so to speak, is the data side of the equation. Now, obviously, I've gotten to be a bit more familiar with that on my side of the job, but putting Signal AI aside, FHS has invested in an array of data companies. As far as I'm aware from the bio, Morning Consult and Apple Card and Quoted and Integral, some really great companies out there doing some very interesting things, both on the external and internal landscape. I'd just be interested in your macro perspective on how data companies can get to a place of higher utility. We were talking about this before the show, about not intimidating most of the people in a comms function, but really feeling intuitive. In what ways are the higher end C-suite advisor, management consulting type comms and marketing professionals getting closer to the data companies, whether that's stakeholder analysis and running focus groups, if not the big data stuff like scanning millions and millions of media conversations like we do at Signal? How can the data companies get closer to being useful?
Yeah, great question. I think the challenge, at least that I see, well, it's a few things. One is, I think the average person in the consulting side does not yet really understand AI to the extent that they need to. I mean, nobody was even talking about AI 2 years ago. So the learning curve, in a relatively short period of time is dramatic. And I think you have to make a deliberate effort to learn. I mean, I just spoke to, for example, to somebody who I have a lot of respect for, I think has deep expertise in this space. And I asked if they would to do like a 5 or 6 session course for FHS Capital Partners, just frankly, for my 2 business partners and maybe a few other folks in some of the portfolio companies we have, because I kind of want to go to school on it. I mean, I play with the tools and, doing work with Signal AI. I mean, I have some familiarity, but it's not nearly as much as it should be. And I have a feeling a lot of people are in the same boat. So first is you need to understand what it's capable of in order to then basically answer your question. Assuming you do that, the challenge I think that's out there for if you're thinking about what clients need and what they want, it's the marriage of data analysis with, I'll call it human insight, but human insight may not be right. I mean, AI may cover 80, 90% of that. I don't think you could just outsource data and insights. I mean, you can outsource it at a tactical level. In other words, I could hire Signal AI, for example, to do, or I, get a license to use your product. Getting a license to use your product is probably more valuable and long-term effective because I need to immerse myself in the data and the insights and then interpret that for my client's needs, understanding what the client is. Now, I think, again, I'm not expert in AI enough. I think AI will get me, I don't know, 75% of the way there. But
Right. But
that
that
last,
final 25% of what do we do about it, grounded in gut instinct and your knowledge about the client or your own business, we're still pretty far away from. And would you
well,
even
that
trust a machine?
okay, but that's where people need to come in and add that last 25%.
Yep.
And I think that's what clients are really, really hungry for. The more I see dashboards and charts and so forth, it's like I get the data. Now, I maybe if I was the brand manager on a product, I'd want to immerse myself in some, I mean, everybody's got different interests depending upon, their role and what kind of data they're looking for. But ultimately, I want kind of high level interpretation and strategic guidance about what this all means. And then based on that kind of conversation and insight, I will then go deep to understand what's behind it. But I need to kind of understand where this is all going and who are kind of key drivers, where the key levers are, and so forth. And I think clients are desperately hungry for that. And I think, consulting firms and people kind of doing this kind of work are trying to figure out how to best deliver that.
My hot take is it's all coming together, right? That a data driven smart strategist and a data company that needs strategists to make the output of those platforms useful, those are really two sides of the same coin. And it's all grounded in learning. And that's sort of where I wanted to go next.
Yeah.
You are, above being a really great professional, an educator, right? You've worked with the USC Center for Public Relations for, I believe, 2 decades. You're on the board of Page Society, where we cross paths, which is fundamentally a professional development and membership organization. And now you're doing this thing at Duke. I would be very interested to understand, if you were starting like a company today, or as you mentor younger people getting into the industry today, are there any sort of key tenets, pieces of advice, core skills? You talked, of course, about being conversant in AI, but who knows? Maybe it is having an example of a communications campaign, or thinking more cross-functionally beyond comms into the impact of public policy issues like tariffs, not just on comms, but the broader business. I would be interested, how are you counseling students or younger professionals in their 20s, early 30s about how to be the next highly relevant Bob Feldman?
At the risk of cliche, it starts with continuous learning. You just need to be intellectually curious and learn. Two, closely related to that, is you can't think of yourself in a career box. And, most people say, well, I don't, but I think most people do because, I don't know, when you go out and you meet people, whether it's socially or professionally, the first thing so many people ask you is, what do you do? I mean, that kind of starts to put you in a box, right? I mean, kind of, you need some definitions. I kind of understand that. But, you know, we talked about the importance of integration, whether it's data and kind of human strategic insight, or, I talked about the importance of integration early when it comes to these large holding companies, and whether it's, marketing or public relations or public policy and so forth. So I think constantly pushing yourself outside what may be perceived as a bit of a box is critical. The opportunity for you to become, the CXO, whatever officer going to be of a company, or for that matter, the CEO of an agency or a consulting firm and so forth, is going to be driven by your expertise in a variety of areas that have overlapping functional interests. It's not limited to data and analytics. It's not limited to marketing or advertising or digital advertising or public relations or crisis communications or public policy. It's all of that. Now, you can't be an expert in everything, but I think, the really successful people in the future are going to have deep expertise in something that's really important and what I'll say moderate expertise in a whole lot of other things.
And let's talk a little bit about why our national civic discourse hinges on that ability. And you have founded something called the Dialogue Project. I think it's in its fifth year now, grounded at Duke University in the Fuqua Business School. And what I think is really fascinating is the idea here is it's about businesses doing more to fight polarization and improve civil discourse at a time when the country needs it perhaps as much as ever since the Revolutionary War. I'm, by the way, beaming in here from Boston, where we celebrated this weekend the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Let's hope we don't have another one. The Dialogue Project might go a long way towards doing just that and preventing further strife here. Tell me a little bit about why you started the Dialogue Project and what role the people who are working within it can play in terms of fostering a less polarized, more inclusive dialogue, starting first and foremost with the institutions that really shape our economy, big businesses.
Yeah. So it grew probably the way most things should grow, and that was pretty organically. I mean, it started because I got an award from the Page Society in 2019, so it was 5 years ago now. And I had to give a speech. So I decided, all right, well, what am I going to talk about? And I think in the past, a number of people talked about the role of communications in business and society, and I don't know, interesting, but I don't know. I didn't think I had that much more to add to it. But I decided to kind of focus on polarization because this goes back to 2019. It was pretty bad, and I thought there was something that the business community could do. This problem is not going to be solved by any one organization or one industry or any one initiative. It's, everybody's got to do something. So, in any case, I gave a talk on that. I actually asked a few friends at different companies to throw in a little bit of money, and we had Morning Consult do a piece of global research on that. I asked some other friends if they would have their CEOs and other business leaders write thought pieces on the role of business for that. And so we had Jamie Dimon and Mary Barra, Doug McMillan, and some other people write things for it. And we profiled a few companies and what they were doing to kind of address this issue. Companies like General Mills and Allstate and Chevron and some others. So we kind of announced the research and, kind of published it. And honestly, this was just supposed to be a speech that became a little bit of a research project as well. But then it got picked up. I mean, it started to gain some traction. All of a sudden, it was in the Wall Street Journal and Fortune. The Harvard Business Review wrote a story on it. I mean, it started to get a lot of attention. And then I thought, well, geez, this is kind of resonating, and it seems a shame for this to be kind of one and done, that this actually could be a program. And polarization wasn't, unfortunately, as we all know, it wasn't getting any better. So I thought, all right, let's kind of keep this thing going, but it would benefit by having an infrastructure. And I thought an academic infrastructure was the right kind of, for a whole host of reasons, intellectual rigor, resourcing, and credibility, and so forth. So I spoke to a bunch of communication schools as well as business schools, not having any idea if anybody would be interested in kind of taking this program and partnering basically to build it. The good news is there's a lot of interest. And I think the reason was, frankly, schools then and schools today are still wrestling with how do we teach leadership in an environment when the population is so polarized and so diverse? We've seen the consequences of that about the reluctance of people to engage in conversations on college campuses. We just know that, I mean, this issue is an enormous problem. So I think, there's no textbook. I think professors were trying to figure out how do we teach this? How do we get some content? And I think they saw that the Dialogue Project might be a means by which they could actually generate content to then share with their MBA students or communication students and so forth. The dean at Fuqua at the Duke Business School was super passionate about the subject, and so it seemed like a nice, logical place to kind of partner. I liked candidly the fact that they were in North Carolina, meaning a bit of a purple state as opposed to a school in Massachusetts or in California and so forth. Well-regarded business school. I thought it actually was very appealing that it was a business school. So they've been very, very supportive. So we've been doing it at Fuqua now for just shy of 5 years. Very supportive. We do a lot of programming targeting the business community generally, as well as I was hinting, MBA students and undergraduate students as well.
And what are the initiatives that the Dialogue Project is pursuing now, particularly at a time when I would call civic dialogue the story? What are some of the most exciting initiatives, if not results, stemming from them that you're excited about? Because obviously the country and many democracies around the world, for what it's worth, are asking, what is the role of the other side? How do we find consensus, regardless of who that other side is? And are businesses at a time of declining trust in government and a nadir of trust for Congress, the institutions that can uphold a different way of behaving ethically in the world? There are the institutions of trust, so to speak. So tell me a little bit about how the dialogue is trying to put a dent in that universe.
Yeah, I would say two things. One of the things that we did starting about a little over a year ago was take a look at how do we better scale our work because we've got, I mean, every organization has limited resources. How do we have greater impact? So for one of the programming activities we've undertaken, we partner with SHRM and with Page. So SHRM, as many of your listeners I'm sure know, is the Society for Human Resource Management. They have something like 300,000 members around the world, really world-class association representing the HR community. And Page, as most of you folks know, it represents senior corporate affairs, chief communications officers, and so forth. So we partner with them on something that we call the Civility Call series. And every month we have a session for many of their members, taking a look at difficult issues that are facing our society, but particularly with a kind of a workplace or stakeholder angle. Candidly, this started in 2024 when there was a lot of concern by CEOs, by general counsels, by CCOs, CHROs, that because of polarization and the political campaign season, a lot of concern about workplace disruption, even violence in the workplace. So we started having these calls to kind of explore that and help CCOs, CHROs kind of navigate that and try to kind of bring the temperature down in their workplace. We've continued that. We have a call coming up next week, for example. We're exploring what's going on university campuses right now and how can communications and HR executives kind of, there again, navigate. We're looking at the business sector overall. We're looking at universities. These are large scale kind of sectors that if we help kind of dial down the temperature and can help constituencies there learn how to have more productive conversations with people who disagree, that's going to be our contribution to the much larger issue around the entire, across all of society for this. So, next week we have a call with senior folks from Yale, Penn, University of Pittsburgh, and Duke, and many, many HR and communications executives joining in, kind of understanding how these universities are dealing with this, best practices, what they've learned, and so forth. So we're doing this on a regular basis. That's just one example, but it's an example of what we're trying to do at scale. The other thing I mentioned is we just started also with the Dialogue Project, something we call the Business Council, and we're reaching out to companies, and it could be senior communications people or other functions who want to really kind of get engaged in this, particularly if the senior leadership has a passion for this, the senior leadership, anybody in the C-suite. So we've got a range of companies now. I don't want to start rattling them off, but we just started this. We have some really great Fortune 100 companies that are participating in the Business Council, and we're going to use them to frankly brainstorm and help identify more ways we could be more impactful to help companies deal with this issue. Because I mean, every CEO and every business leader will tell you, a polarized society means a polarized workforce. And this whole polarization is you see what's going on right now. It's completely counterproductive for business. Uncertainty is not good for business. It's not, legislation doesn't get accomplished. It's a big concern for the Business Roundtable. It's a big concern for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and it's a big concern for individual companies. So we're just trying to kind of do what we can to help address some of those issues and create some best practice dialogue to tamp it down and find some common ground.
I think one of the cool things about you is you're metaphorically both wearing cap and gown and suit and tie. You're both a business guy and grounded in academia as well. And we just did some analysis here that was published in Axios. Shout out to Eleanor Hawkins. Two interesting points that came out of it. the companies that maintained their DEI commitments, obviously at a time when many are rolling them back, actually saw strong growth in sentiment. The companies that are trying to meet the moment, for example, Meta or Target or McDonald's actually saw a little bit of a drop. And then multiplying that on the global context, we're seeing a lot of American brands really decline in terms of their sentiment, if not their overarching reputation, as being seen as standard bearers for America, particularly, but operating in global markets. So we see companies ranging from Chevron to Uber to Warner Brothers Discovery to Starbucks to NVIDIA, all sort of declining in light of this new administration and some of the actions that are taken. I would just be interested, do you have any case studies, whether there are particular executives, particular companies, great corporate affairs professionals you wanted to shout out? Is anybody doing this well? Is there any case study, even if you don't drop names, just in terms of ninja skills that you've been impressed by in terms of lowering the temperature?
Before I say that, I wanted to address what you were just kind of getting at as it reflects to the integration of what we were saying before about data insights, and somebody tells me, okay, now what do I do with those insights? What you're talking about right now with, kind of the DEI and what the data is showing. So if you're backing off, the data is showing that that's only going to hurt your brand. I think, that's a great example. The data will show that, but I think most CEOs or CHROs or whoever will then say, okay, I understand that, but threading that needle and figuring out how do I do what you're describing to me other than just cosmetically saying, well, we just won't use the initials DEI, which is really not a particularly thoughtful way to do it. That's a perfect example, what you were getting at, kind of DEI, the problems with that, but how do you move forward? That's a perfect example of where I think the opportunity is for integration of data and insights with kind of human guidance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, yeah, I want to ask, are there any people that you're impressed by? I mean, I'll give you a quick example. When Jamie Dimon had that leaked audio being like, you guys all got to come back to the office. We didn't become one of the world's great companies, sitting in sweatpants on Zoom. Perhaps not the pinnacle of lowering the temperature, a bit of a divisive comment. And then, similarly, we can see, other American brands localizing themselves in a way where they're doing quite well. Interestingly, like McDonald's hasn't been hit as hard as you might think because their, for example, menu items are extremely local to the market in India or China, let alone the US. So I'm just wondering, are there any favorites that you have of, hey, these guys are doing a good job. They haven't solved it perfectly yet, but they're doing a good job threading the needle?
Yeah, I think, I'll give you a few examples, at least from my own experience. I think Southwest Airlines has been doing a really good job. Bob Jordan there, Linda Rutherford, who had been running communications and marketing up until I think a few weeks ago, has been leading a really strong effort. Their culture is, Southwestern culture is, kind of their competitive advantage. So I think they're quite deep into it. I would say KPMG, I think, has done some really good work. Paul Knott is their U.S. CEO. They've done a decent amount. Albert Bourla at Pfizer. I think Pfizer under Albert, Sally Sussman is, their head of public affairs, does a lot. I think Vince Tizio at Axis Capital. What you kind of find, or at least what I found, is the work itself is not necessarily something that's going to be, in the front page of the Wall Street Journal, but the leadership is committed to making a difference. And they tend to do a lot of programming that may be below the radar, but has an impact in the organizations. There are a couple of programs that I think get a little bit more attention. General Mills, for example, I think they still run a program called Courageous Conversations, where they bring their people together and actually talk about really difficult issues, the kind of issues that most companies think of as third rail issues, they actually get involved with. Allstate, for many years, has partnered with the Aspen Institute on something called the Better Arguments Project, where they kind of embrace and go into communities and help people learn how to have better arguments. Literally kind of have, an ability to have more productive conversations with people who you disagree with. So I think there are some programs like that that tend to get some attention and are kind of high profile. But I think there's also a lot of really good work being done by a lot of companies that are a little bit below the radar but have an impact. And the common denominator is usually a CEO who cares.
Right. Well, I think those are just fabulous examples. And by the way, a lot of them can only be proven by a counterfactual. Something didn't happen. The shit didn't hit the
Right.
fan. And unless you're
Right.
tracking it every day and scoring it like we are here, then they're de facto not in the
Hmm.
headlines, right? They're
Yeah.
being more celebrated, which is, of course, not going to generate as many headlines, but is net
Yeah.
positive for the brand's
Yeah.
reputation. I wanted to zoom out. I know that at the Dialogue Project, you just posted about running the New Ideas competition. And I'm wondering if any of these got to your old world of like strategy and management consulting and org design. But let's just say you're a CCO listening to this podcast and you're trying to build the comms function of the future, or you're an agency leader and you've been tasked by some big Fortune 500 company of at least operating as that external agency comms function of the future. I would just be interested, are there any sort of key tenets, certain types of roles, the ways that they might embrace data? Choose your own adventure. What does the comms function of the future look like?
Oh boy, that's a great question. My partner Don Spentner kind of makes a partial living spending his time doing this stuff. So he's probably better than I am to answer this. I'll tell you a few things. One is, at the risk of the obvious, data should drive not necessarily everything, but a lot. I mean, there's just way too much data available to people to not take advantage of that. And to me, it probably comes down to what are the right prompts, meaning what are you looking for, making sure you drill down and you really get the insight that you need. The second thing I would say is I would want to have an organization comprised of a couple of different kinds of people. The first is people who have strong competency in a specific requirement of the function. So that could be writing, it could be kind of graphic design, it could be strategic insight around corporate reputation or crisis management and so forth. So I'd want that. But then the other thing I would want is I would want to recruit out of other functions in either my own company or other companies. I mean, I want people out of sales, I want people out of operations, I want people who've been working in plants. I've been working, I need diversity in the truest form in my organization. I think the communications organizations, for the most part, have been, too occupied, they're a bit too insular. Communications people work in communications. I mean, maybe that sounds kind of obvious, but I think that's actually in its own way a little problematic. I think that's, by the way, probably true for other functions as well. So I would want people who have deep expertise in understanding supply chain, people who understand human resources, people who understand a whole host of other kind of business imperatives, but who have a personal interest in, if not passion, for communications. I don't think we do enough of that. And I think if you're sitting down in an advisory role, if you're in-house or if you're a consultant, when you bring that kind of expertise to the table, it's frankly distinctive and gives you, if it's a consulting firm, a competitive advantage. And if you're in-house, it gives you a seat at the business table as opposed to just kind of a tactical representation.
Well, I can't tell you how much I love that on a personal level. I'm really proud that over here we've hired from diverse backgrounds like political fundraiser and former bench scientists and anti-smoking campaigners, let alone communications experts. And that's really, really cool to hear you reflecting that ethos, particularly in a time, let's be frank, where big companies have hiring bias, unless they've seen somebody have a similar title in a similar industry. They're often not inclined to make that hire. And I think what you're saying is pushing it even further. I mean, the idea you would take someone from operations or sustainability or who's worked at a manufacturing plant and train them in the storytelling skills of comms, I think is going to be essential going forward. It's a real model to replicate regardless of what industry you're in, from life sciences to planes at Southwest Airlines, because communications is responsible for one thing above all else, having the broadest possible perspective to understand the implications of not just the navel gazing of your own narrative, but how your narrative might resonate across industries and indeed across stakeholder groups, ranging from protests and advocacy organizations to journalists at big papers. So just really cool to hear you say that.
Interesting, because when you say the broadest perspective, I think that's true. But then if you think about kind of the media landscape, then you have to get incredibly narrow and micro in order to be relevant to your specific target audience, right? So if you're going to be incredibly specific and relevant to a very tightly defined audience, you better have people who understand that audience,
Mm.
and the days of kind of dancing around that, I think, are long gone.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember back when I was in agency world, my client at Johnson & Johnson was the chief information officer, and he really cared about being in CIO magazine and doing hackathons. And I'd be lying if I told you I had real expertise in like the hardcore IT space. And I was probably furthest along because I was like the data guy in the agency. So hiring somebody from that background and training them in like the most human skill there is, which is being able to communicate with others, something that's truly like innately encoded in our genetics, probably is the right hiring strategy. But it remains important that you elevate out of your bias and not just look for common comms experience, but actually relevant industry experience and indeed audience knowledge. I wanted to zoom out. This question I definitely don't think you're going to see coming, but it's my last question. I see you wearing a Masters sweatshirt right now. And in looking at your display behind you, which Room Rater would definitely give a 9 out of 10, the only book I can see is golf. So I'm assuming you're a golf fan. Rory McIlroy charges back to win his 5th major, I believe is the case, at last week's Masters in Augusta. Gets his monkey off his back in terms of being able to complete the career Grand Slam. His daughter is the same name as my daughter, Poppy, and he says, Poppy, never give up on your dreams. That's what I demonstrate. What can communicators learn from Rory McIlroy's patience and resilience, and indeed his performance under pressure in the playoff to complete the career Grand Slam?
Get a psychologist. That's the list. Because it seems to be Rory, he hired, I forget this guy's name, but he's been working with a sports psychologist who apparently is quite accomplished. And I heard him actually in an interview, I don't know, a couple of days ago, and basically said, what he's focused on now, you hear this all the time from professional athletes, all I can focus on is the process. I can't control the outcome, but I can control the process, right? And he also said that what he's chasing out there is a feeling, how he feels on the golf course, how he's feeling about the swing. So, that back 9, or should I say the second 9 at Augusta on Sunday afternoon, was really quite something. I mean, from the, just kind of awful wedge he hit on number 13 into the water, to that remarkable 7-iron at number 15. So the ability to kind of bounce back, from on number 18, putting in the bunker and then missing the putt to go into another playoff and potentially his whole dream disappearing again, to being able to hit basically that same shot, but much, much closer to the pin. That ability to be so resilient, bounce back. Golf is a head game, and I think, honestly, most of life is a head game. A lot of it is self-confidence. A lot of it is how you kind of approach things, and I think, there's a lot to learn from what Rory did, but it's in your head. It's not about anything else. I mean, his point, and you decide how much you can apply this to life, was there are a lot of people out here with really, really good skills. Okay, there's a lot of people in our industry with a lot of really good skills. It's how you apply those skills that ultimately make the difference.
I love that. I feel like I should be a CIA case officer, the way I put together the Master Sweatshirt, the book, and there you go, off the cuff, going shot by shot, repeating Rory's final round. I'm just glad I was right in that intuition, because that question totally could have bombed. Thank you so much, Bob, for joining Signal in the Noise. Not just your golf knowledge, but your org design knowledge, your entrepreneurship knowledge, the way that you're driving a data-driven communications approach to the Dialogue Project, and many other fascinating career stops before that. Incredibly valuable lessons learned here. Thank you so much for joining us. And last question, how can folks get in touch with you? On LinkedIn, website, etc.?
Yeah, LinkedIn. You just go to me, and that'll give links to the other programs as well. My email, if anybody just wants to write me directly, is bob.feldman@duke.edu. So there you go. Hey, Danny, thank you very much. This was a pleasure. It was a lot of fun talking to you.
Thanks so much. Till next time, this has been another awesome episode of Signal in the Noise.